engagement. That's really been a goal, and it just hasn't completely taken hold.
Yeah.
And so I think if we could really do that, then that would be really good, right? Yeah, so.
We don't have any more problems, do we?
No, we don't, and we're tied to the one in Rio Rancho, and of course, their concerns are, I do attend their meetings, and I try to do, but we're they're very different. I mean, and if you think we're different, there's Cuba going, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna call our, assuming that, Tyson, are you here? Okay, I'm gonna get started. Thank you, all of the councilors, for coming to the Village of Corrales Governing Body Work Study. And so what's going to happen here is I'm calling it to order. We are not going to be having minutes because it's a work study, but just for the record and for those listening, Councilor Woldman?
Present.
Councilor Murray is here. Councilor Knight? Councilor
Here.
Burkett?
Aye.
Councilor Lucero?
Here.
Thank you. So, and then Councilor Parker will be joining us by phone, so all of the councilors are here. The one and only thing on our agenda is discussion of potential amendments to the Cannabis Ordinance. I can take a motion on it. I don't know that it's necessary, but I think we'll just get right into it. And I'm going to turn it over to Randy Audio for some introductory remarks.
Before we do that, Mayor, can I just ask, I know there's a few people that want to join in on the phone. Are they available in already?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. I know that there was some people that was very important to them to get on the phone. I just want to make sure that we have people there already. Okay.
Great.
You might want to lay the ground rules,
Lay the ground rules for the meeting.
Well, it's like any other work study. The public is allowed to listen. They are listening. We're having them come in by the phone. We are not going to make any decisions tonight, but we will be discussing potential amendments to the Cannabis Ordinance. That's what any work study is. All right.
Thank you, Mayor.
Sure.
Well, we did, as we had indicated, we got materials to you early because there's a lot to chew on. Kind of the main thing that I wanted to do that we didn't go into detail on in the materials was why this proposal was the one that we wanted to put before you. And what really came down to was everything we've talked about in regard to, and I'm going to leave off the plate for the moment, banning the growth of marijuana in some zones or some areas. So that's setting that aside for the moment, but we can always talk about it. But for the options to strengthen what we had done within the framework of the state law, and Councilor Knight had mentioned a proposal that would have been a scenic byway proposal. The main issue with that is that we could not see a rational basis or a reasonable basis for distinguishing for the burden placed upon the citizens besides their proximity to the road. And so it just seemed like it would have, if we did that, it would have the effect that if you are fortunate enough to be living close to the road, then you're not going to have to cope with it. Secondly, all of our commercial area is along Corrales Road, which means then that those commercial areas that have more intense uses would not be available for marijuana growing. So that issue, those were the problems with that proposal. We also looked at splitting this up via zones. As you know, and you can see from the map, those are all the zones we have within the county. The vast majority is A1 and A2.
You mean Corrales?
Within the village. Sorry, strike that. Yeah. I'll have the record reflect that I said village every time I say something else. So the main issue is because this was built, always has been, and historically agricultural community, this was kind of our catch-22 in the sense that the state is, I think, properly classifying marijuana is an agricultural product, although it is a very different agricultural product than many. It has many challenges because of the way it's grown and so forth, as we've discussed. So if you say we looked at, for example, saying, okay, no grows besides individual grows, personal use in A1. Well, that takes out almost the whole village because that's the predominant zoning for the whole village. So that didn't really make a lot of sense. We talked about grading it, more intense uses in H2 because usually there's more land involved, but not necessarily. There's many lots that aren't very big that are in H2. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense to divide it up that way. So that's, hello?
Go ahead.
So the way that we could deal with it in a way that matched some logical system was to follow the state plan and put in the smaller lots, no growing. If it's an acre or more, the smallest grows that the state authorizes, which are 100 plants under their new regulations, and then above 2 acres going up to the 200 for a micro grow up to 200, and then larger parcels of 5 acres and more, so that there can be, for larger industrial grows, so there can be more buffering and more setbacks. So that was our rationale to do that, was to try to create greater buffering for the more intense uses for the harms that we've identified, the smell and the appearance of having these industrial type buildings on a farm, a piece of agriculture. The downside of it is we would have to deal with all future agricultural grows that are occurring within greenhouses in the same manner. So we can't separate out the two. For marijuana, we can put greater regulations on how it's done because of the smell and so forth. But for appearance reasons, any greenhouse has the same appearance as a marijuana greenhouse physically, and can be grown. There can be multiple crops grown at multiple hours for other crops as well. And that was the rationale for why we separated the way we did in our proposal. Obviously, there are multitudinous ways to skin the cat. I think we have already put in reasonable protections. This would take it a step farther. And could we be challenged? And the answer is yes. The way the setbacks would, the people who would be affected the greatest by the setbacks that we're proposing are those unusually shaped lots. And we have a lot of lots in the village that are narrow and long. And those would have a hard time meeting those setback requirements. And those folks could feel like they're being singled out and not allowed to grow in the way that the state law allows them to. And we could be challenged on that basis. It was reasonable and rational, but it still has consequences for people who want to use their property for that legal purpose. So that's kind of a summation. We can certainly get into details and talk about other options as people wish. To me, it strikes the best balance we can given the zoning we have. The other option would be to look at rezoning, which would be a terrible, difficult mess of a process, but it is an option to say that at this time in our history, we believe it's appropriate to create other zones for more industrial type uses in these areas. So that would be a possibility if we wish.
I'm going to turn this down here. So
All right, I mean, I tend to agree that rezoning probably has a whole lot of consequences that are even difficult for us to imagine right now. But what kind of process would we use if we were trying to rezone?
The zone change process essentially would be, looking at sectors of town, sectors of the village, which could, tolerate more intense uses because of their topography, because of the fact that it's not as built up as other parts. It is more, open to development. And then you would look at creating options for that property. You don't have to take away people's rights to develop it in its current zoning manner, but you can give them the option to change the zoning. And if they meet the criteria for a zone change, we would then apply that zone change, and they could do the former use, or they could do the more intense agricultural use that we've been talking about.
If I could just, a couple of preliminary things. Councilor Burkett, several weeks ago, mentioned that our concern should be not for the growers, but for our constituents. We are a village of 10 square miles with not a lot of options. The statute says, page 42, not very much a local jurisdiction in the 172 pages.
There was no favors done by the state legislature.
No, and I know that as of January 1st, some things may come down. But rules that, quote, reasonably limit density. So we have an area that has been designated for commercial operations, light industry or whatever, in the northwest sector. There's already some, we have the solar panels there. There's a long strip with potentially water from Rio Rancho that could support growth. Rather than the A1, A2, and if we limit the amount of growing potential, is that something we could concentrate on?
Well, for sure, for the intense agricultural uses, as we discussed the last time, at a minimum, you're going to allow, by law, personal grows up to 12 plants, 12 mature plants. And so any, quote, adverse effects, odors and so forth, are going to be in any neighborhood where someone so chooses to grow. But for larger grows, I think your idea we could work towards something like that if it's the will of the council to take more intense grows and place them in an area of the county that is more reasonable. Yes, thank you.
So I think, and I don't know, do you want us to ask before we speak, or how do you want to handle this?
No,
Just
go
open-
ahead,
okay.
this is like an open forum.
So I think there is a big difference between the 12 plants and anything 13 and above, because nobody's going to build a greenhouse or all that stuff for the 12 plants. And they have to be concealed from public view, correct, for personal growth?
Corey, I'll let you did the digging on that.
I did do the digging on that, and that was what I recalled, but on seriously scouring the regulations, that does not seem to exist.
Okay, and I had just listened to the Los Ranchos discussion on this, and they addressed that specific point as well, because that was their understanding and their legal counsel's understanding of it as well, that if you were 12 plants or less for personal use, it had to be outside of public view. So I think that eliminates some of our problems. I think that nobody's going to invest in a noisy filter. I think the smell, it's certainly a concern, and it's a concern that I don't know as a village we're doing a good job of managing with some of the facilities we already have, because I'm sure you guys all do too. You get invitations on a daily basis to come up and smell the smell.
But can I just say that I do know something about that, because I've talked to our compliance person who's been out there, and a major grow that is the elephant in the room here, which is going to be there because it's already been there, it's legal.
Right.
They have sort of state-of-the-art filters. It's inside, they go there, they look. That's correct, is it not, Lori?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, I'm asking Lori Stout, the Director of Planning and Zoning, to just verify. I happen to have a conversation with the compliance officer, and she's also been up there a lot. And our regulations do include a mandate for the best stuff they know how to do right now, the best filters and upgrading maintenance and,
But we're
and
not
they've
man-
been there.
I think there's a problem though, because when you go up, that's just a sliver of time in which you are taking a snapshot of what's
Sure.
going on. The residents up there have complained bitterly, and I know I've gotten emails from Fort Coons and others that live up there. It is driving them nuts because they can't sit outside and enjoy the,
I mean, I think that is something that we all have to deal with.
But-
And I think there are odor problems that if the wind's blowing the right way, I just don't know what we're doing. I think this body is really making a really deliberate effort to try to protect people. And I just, that one also is, as I say, it's legal. It's not going anywhere.
Are we mandating the procedures or are we mandating the outcome? Because if they have a HEPA filter that's not preventing the neighbors from having a nuisance, I thought our current legislation says that we are protecting them from a nuisance, regardless of if they're trying every possible solution and those solutions aren't working to prevent the nuisance, then I feel they're still in violation. And I feel like the technology doesn't currently exist to prevent people, regardless of people's best intentions with these grows, from negatively affecting their neighborhoods.
correct, and I
Why don't
think,
you answer that, counsel, because that's not a bad question. I mean, I actually asked a question today about if we could double wrap, second skin, certain greenhouses if they did seem to emit an odor that would put them into a nuisance category.
Mayor Roque?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Tyson. Sorry to have to call in for the meeting on there. I think what appears to be a very important issue with this is that these scrubbers and the air filtration technology is a very specialized field or profession. And I think that myself included, we are not up to date as to what could be done or if the most aggressive scrubbers are being used at the elephant's greenhouse on there.
Okay.
So maybe it's,
Thank you, Councilor Parker. I had a question on the floor, and I'm gonna ask our council to address what you just said as well.
Sure. So, I mean, it's all tied together. The easy answer is that, and Councilor Murray had actually forwarded me a couple of articles
Right.
to address this sort of same point. And the real answer is that, yes, the state of the art and the most effective in terms of odor mitigation is going to be the carbon scrubbers. The disadvantage to that is that they work on an absorption rate as opposed to an absorption rate. So what happens is that these are, they're porous charcoal that will become filled with whatever hits them first. So where the ordinance was designed to address this system, so what will happen is that the plant, when it begins to flower, it's going to start smelling more. In turn, your grower is going to need to increase the circulation to keep the temperatures mitigated. What that oftentimes does is it overloads that filter really fast because there's more smell getting caught up in that charcoal filter much more quickly. Because it's not a sponge, what happens is that those particles become displaced. When they get displaced, they get shot outside, and that's when your neighbors start noticing the nuisance and have a problem.
So our nuisance laws, are they for the outcome or for the effort? I mean, what are we legislating? If it creates a nuisance despite their best efforts to minimize or get rid of the nuisance, they're still in violation of nuisance laws, correct?
Arguably, yes. My contention is that if the neighbor can smell it for longer than them allegedly changing the filter, then I don't believe that they're doing their best. I don't think that they're complying with our ordinance, which states when it becomes no longer effective, it needs to be a new one. It needs to not be something that they have taken off, shaken up, said, yeah, it's good long enough to abate the odor so that Laura can come smell it and be sure that it doesn't stink for today.
Councilor Knight?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that they may have filters on, but they may not, the literature that Stuart sent us and the other literature that I read said that you have to change those every 2 to 4 months.
Exactly.
And that's where, like you said, are they changing them or are they shaking them out and, spraying water through them or an air filter or something and then thinking, okay, because it's so costly. So if we do have something in our ordinances, maybe we need to say it needs to be, whether it's saturated or not, every 2 months, it has to be thrown out. And that needs, that would have to be, again, people maybe have the best intentions, but then they don't do it. So that would have to be like really checked every 2 months.
And our zoning officers would have to have the training to know exactly what to look for to make sure they are doing it correctly.
Right. And I was gonna say exactly that. It's hard enough with all of the other issues that Lori and her inspector have on their plate. It's something that we may have to look at as even help from the state to be doing these types of inspections, because Councilor Parker's absolutely right. It's a very specialized, it's like measuring noise when we've talked about noise. It's a scientific process versus just someone going out and saying, well, sounds loud to me. You can't enforce that. So I do think that we can do more with nuisances and on smells. We probably just haven't had the tools in place to do that properly. So it would be really, I think it would be worth looking at what we can do to give ourselves those better tools.
How we could beef up the ability to really accurately measure odor or.
Well, and ascertain that they're on a regular system of replacement of those filters. And I'm not sure, we need to look at how we can enforce that now, and if there's additions we can make to that language to make that better. Because that really is where the rubber meets the road.
I think Councilman Murray.
Yeah, well, one of the things I find that, we just recently passed is we're tying our expectations to one technology. Now, I think we need to remove that and make it an odor mitigation type approach, that we do not limit ourselves just to carbon filters. And that I think it's because we're in the, what section we just recently changed, but we did specify carbon filters. I think that's a mistake because
I agree,
the
it can
technology
change, so.
changes so much that we need to
Absolutely.
say, you will mitigate odor so that it does not affect the adjacent property.
Because I think there's also that, because I looked at your articles and I talked to some other people who've actually been involved in these kinds of things, and some of the ideas that are forwarded actually don't work very well. That's the other problem. They're expensive and they don't work. So I think it's an emerging.
To Councilor Murray's point, and I think, to all cumulative together, just listening to it, it would be incumbent on the producer themselves to not only keep up with the technology, maintain their systems, but also, regardless whether the technology is there or not, it's still incumbent on the producer to make sure that those odors, and it was in the discussions that I had with people that I spoke with, it's kind of like our dark skies ordinance, right? It's kind of like our light ordinances. You got to have apparatus in place to shield that lighting or whatever you got to do, and it's incumbent on you to do it. And to your point, and I get the fact that, it's a very specialized type of situation when I don't know how much training you would need to have to go out and smell what the coons are smelling or otherwise. I believe if they're smelling it, that's the problem, because that is impacting their quality of life and beyond. We all get the emails at whatever hour, we all get those emails to where it's a nuisance. And like I said, it should be treated accordingly, and there should be systems in place to mitigate it altogether, regardless of technology or otherwise. It would be on the producer to rectify that situation, regardless of what it takes.
I think that whatever language we could put in to make it clear that that's our intent. I also think that we have to look at how far we can go in suggesting that because we view this as a nuisance, we get to ban it. Because I think that's absolutely
And-
not what the state has said.
Well, and it's it is something that we're just gonna have to recognize because the ultimate mechanism for enforcing it is going to be court. So the courts
It's
are,
going to be the court.
yes, the courts will set the standards ultimately. And so we need to write the regulations the best we can to accomplish the goal we have, which is to stop it affecting neighbors of these grows. And then we can cite them, and if someone's doing something that is in violation of our ordinance, we can either go to district court with a civil action, or we can go to criminal court with a citation, and then it'll work its way up through the process.
Councilwoman?
Yeah, if I could ask, Lori, talking about the very north end, and the spells and all that, your code enforcement officer has been out there. What are the penalties for nuisance if in fact it's determined to be, nuisance to neighbors?
Well, by our code, the maximum fine is $500. You can cite someone repeatedly day after day after day. And make that accumulate, and it's still at the discretion of the judge whether or not that's imposed.
There's a limit,
And have
right?
they been cited to you?
They have not been cited because,
How many formal complaints have we had filled out versus just emails? 'Cause I know
I'd
there's
have to ask, Officer Wright, but we got one today.
Yeah.
You know, and she had already been on the phone with someone this morning when she got that one. It might have been the same party or it might have been something different, but it's a lot.
Yes, Councilor Parker?
Yeah, a quick question. And Randy, I'm not sure what the answer would be for this. If we're allowing something in these zones and there's a zoning violation, they get fined and they can fix it. And then later on they do it, they get fined, they can fix it. And that could just continue infinitely, correct?
No, Counselor, our power is to file an action which is called a complaint for abatement of a nuisance. And that can be done in district court. It's a civil standard to determine, we have to prove that the nuisance exists and why it is a nuisance. And the classic example is if we can show a judge pictures of a junky yard and it's tangible, that's simple. This one gets a little hinky,
Right.
you know, because we're out there going, no, it really stunk. It really
Yeah.
did. And how can it convince the judge?
Let me explain it a little better. I didn't do a good job. So say the person has a junky yard, they get fined, they clean it up, and then 2 years later it's junky again. They get fined, they clean it up, and this process can continue like that, correct? As long as
Yes,
they're
with-
cleaning it up. If they,
Yes,
if the permitting for these intensive grows is done through a special use permit, if there are violations for it, then their right to have that grows on the property at all can be taken away, correct?
if they're violating the permit, that is correct.
Is
And
that
again,
something that would fall into the category of what we're doing, or no?
we could do that. We could require intensive grows to have a special use permit. That is something we can do. And if it's located in the commercial zone, it's gonna go through that process anyway.
But that would mean, would it not, I'm just being a devil's advocate here because it kind of seems attractive. But remember, agriculture is a fundamental use. You don't have to ask for a permit to do something. So that would mean that then would all agricultural uses become by special,
I think it's
Permit?
only those
Intensive.
intensive grows.
but they would all have to, right? Even if I was intensively growing lettuce.
Well,
They addressed that at the Los Ranchos.
Yes.
They addressed that at the Los
Los
Ranchos.
Ranchos talked about this.
They
They're
talked about this.
90% agricultural residential, and they are comfortable, and their legal counsel is comfortable saying no in any of the agricultural residential zones.
Because of the overlying, the
they have a
the
lot of
fences,
commercial.
the fences,
They said 90% is A1, A2, or A3.
because they had
I
the fences,
understand,
the armed guards, the 24-hour surveillance. They had a slew of issues.
Right.
And granted, let me just make this quick point here now that I got the floor. When it comes to the technology and as far as I'm concerned, it's incumbent on the producer themselves. The article that Stuart sent out, I mean, I've never heard of some of the stuff that they were talking about, to where they tested it to where it's it might not be exactly out there for everybody to have, but it's out there somewhat, to where, like I said, I think as far as some type of a policy goes, I think it's something that we have to be on top of as far as making sure that those systems are in place. Furthermore, I have one more point, and I can't remember it now.
Give it a minute, well, you can
But,
jump back
yeah,
in, but I
okay.
think everybody agrees that we wanna strengthen our regulations to the point where we are asking that they will be using the best technology available. We're not gonna call something out to the exclusion of others, but that we will expect that, we will have a regulatory scheme and some kind of a follow-through. And right now, maybe our nostrils are not the best, but we have to, I think the state's gonna come up with having to deal with this, not just from us, so how we do that. Stuart,
Well, I'd like
and that.
with, Councilor Burkett go.
Well, so I think we all agree that we're not sure what the best technology is right now, other than distance, is clearly the number one technology to avoid nuisances. I think we all agree that we don't have the resources or the tools to actually measure whether these technologies are being used appropriately. And just to wade into the deep end of the pool, I mean, I think the only way to minimize problems is to not allow it in A1 and A2. I just don't think we are properly equipped to manage it and can't be asked to do so. So that would be, I mean, that's going to be my eventual suggestion. I don't know that we have the tools to manage it any other way than distance. That's the only thing we have that we know works.
So where are you proposing it that it would be legal in the village?
So, I mean, northwest quadrant, commercial where they could, but I don't think any A1, A2 are historic.
That's my feeling too, in that I have noticed that in Roswell, they have banned certain zones as well. Until, I don't know how, Los Ranchos was doing it tonight, but.
Tomorrow they're voting.
Tomorrow, I mean, but right now, they ban it from A1 and A2, in their,
And even
residential zone.
AC, their commercial
Well, we
combined
used
agricultural.
to as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think that there are plenty of examples around the state where it has been banned in the agricultural residential areas. And I think
They had that
we have
amendment on the
legal
floor.
standing to do it.
So,
And commercial, we have plenty of commercial area. We have roughly,
204 acres.
about 200 acres of commercial property within the village. Now, not all of that is available, but it's there, and we're not prohibiting it. We are just saying you can't do it in A1 and A2.
It's
Commercial.
certainly not very fair to the people who live in the residential zones that are right up against the commercial.
Well, it may be, but that's the best we could do.
Well, and they knew that it was commercial when they moved there. I mean, we're
Oh,
not
no,
changing
No,
zones.
that's actually incorrect, Councilor Burkett.
I mean,
There have been, commercial things there long before there were, it's an old village, and it just kind of, there've been both of those
Yeah.
uses. It's not ideal. I mean, I get what you're saying. I just think we have to be able to defend it. I think the ideas that the council worked hard to put forth would have the effect of limiting density all over the village, a little bit more, in a more targeted way that would help more people perhaps, and try to get that buffer zone. But, it's, I don't know, Randy, where do you come down on
well,
this?
the problem is you guys are unique. This village is a unique place. That's why this matters. But in its uniqueness, it has limited us to so few commercial or light industrial, or certainly heavy industrial, that doesn't exist. And so that's where we will be challenged, is because, in other words, the state of New Mexico mandates something like this. They say, this is going to be legal from now on. Well, if we do anything that's reasonable, all our regulations of time, place, and manner have to be reasonable. So that will be the test. Is this reasonable? And I get what you're saying. I mean, it is it's a really difficult thing to say, okay, all these grows are going to be allowable, and they could be your next door neighbor. Even if they're small, they still could be your next door neighbor anywhere. That's very difficult.
But it won't get rid of some of the roads that exist now.
No.
Oh, go ahead, Kath.
Just real quick, and to your point, that Corrales is a very, very special place, to the point to where and I'm just gonna kind of make this broad statement because we touched on it. We do have probably more commercial property than people think we do. I did some math, and there was about 204 acres. In a village that's 10 square miles with 8,500, 9,000 people, with 2 operations already in here. How much, and then all the other things that I kind of preach on all the time as far as water usage in our septic tanks, in our infrastructures, and the way that that's all set up. We have to be able to think of that. We have to think of our natural resources, right? Our water usage and our disposal types of situations that this type of, especially in an intense type of situation, can garner. We have to watch all that. We're not like other places. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Go ahead, Mal.
No,
Go ahead. I'm done. I get a little.
Climb down off that box.
I'm sorry, I'll just climb down off this soapbox. Off this little soapbox. I just worry about it.
Okay, so my thought is, so if all of these Corrales, Los Ranchos, Roswell, all these small municipalities say we can't figure out a way to do this because no one wants it in our communities, doesn't the legislature come January have to figure out and say that these places don't want it? And there has to be some rules for them then, because they are unique places. I mean, our legislators kind of put this on our lap, and we're saying, no, that this isn't gonna work. You need to come up with a way to help us out and to make our unique place stay unique, or else it's you know, New Mexico is so big. There's plenty of places to do grow.
Well, let's, Counselor, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm
Refinish.
done.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, given what you said, that to me, and your proposals, I totally get where you're coming from. I understand the rationale. Are you folks saying that all the way from micro grows of 100 plants and up, all the way through the intense agricultural grows, none of them can be an A1 or A2?
This,
That's what I would say.
Ordinance 1802, that's the one that was the standard before we changed it. That was what was approved by previous council, banning in A1 and A2.
But
Remember, the law changed in the
Right.
state though.
But it doesn't mean our law had to change.
Yes, it does. We're creatures of the state.
It just said A1 and A2. It did not say anything about commercial.
every one of us here that's elected took an oath to follow state law. Okay, you may not like it, but we don't get to totally pick and choose. And I'd just like you to understand that I think council is trying to find a way that we can be as protective as possible without, you know, winding up immediately in court, and knowing that, of course, for the existing grows,
I mean, I feel like commercial feels reasonable. It doesn't feel unreasonable, and I feel like if we were to look at our 200 acres versus our overall geography, that it's probably about the same percentage that Albuquerque is approving. I mean,
And that will be our challenge. If we went that direction, that would be exactly the challenge.
so we would have to look at other municipalities stated.
I
1% of
think
theirs is approved, 1% of ours is approved, so we're good.
The problem I have with, and the reason this is challenging is because it is being treated by state law as an agricultural product in the same way. And given that, our village is full of agriculture. So if you say no grows except your personal use of 12 mature plants, nothing else, there's a whole lot of people that are not going to be able to get a privilege given by state law.
Right.
And that's the challenge.
We may or may not have a fence ordinance coming up that limits people on Corrales Road to a 4-foot solid fence. Then we're gonna have a state law that says that they have to have a 6-foot fence with security and cameras if they're growing marijuana. How do we reconcile those two things?
State prevails.
yeah, I mean, Lori, I'm sorry, I think I wanted, Lori's had her hand up, and then Counselor Parker, I know, I'm looking at this squid-like object in the middle of the table. I know you've got a question.
I know you're ignoring me because I'm not big.
No,
so-
I'm not. Can I have Lori speak to what she wanted to say?
Counselor, I mean, we have this proposal in here, you need X amount of acres in order to do a certain amount of growth, right? Randy, is it supportable if we that up a little bit more, I'm just thinking out loud. There's Trees of Crow, so there's 18 acres. That's an intensive farming operation. There's Wagner Farms, who has a pretty good sized acreage. There's Silverleaf Farms. So we're saying you have to have a pretty good chunk of land in order to do maybe even the micro grow. And that's, the big producers will just have to go somewhere else. But perhaps you can have your greenhouse with your 100 plants if you have, I don't know, 4 acres, whatever that amount is, but bump it up. And it's kind of in keeping with what we have now. That is going to eliminate, there's still some parcels in the village mixed in with A1. There's a 22-acre parcel off of Old Church. There's a few bigger parcels, but not very many.
And Lori, that's exactly the kind of idea. That's why a work study session is a good thing. There is nothing wrong with that concept. The same test will be applied when a court looks at it. Is this a reasonable limitation given who you are as a village?
Okay, Counselor Parker.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I think, Lori, I think you're onto something on there, but let me go back to what my original thought was. And one is the idea of how we could defend us not putting it in A1 and A2. It's the uniqueness of Corrales is that A1 and A2 is our residential zones. And I don't believe the intent of this state law is to allow intensive growing in residential zones. And so because we don't have that ordinances on there, we're protecting our residential zones, although they're A1 and A2, from that intensive growing. And if we want to make it so that people are still allowed to have their giant lettuce farms in a greenhouse, we could set it up with a special use permit that requires people who are applying for it to prove that it's not going to be detrimental to the health, welfare, safety, yada, yada of the community. And I think it's very clear that if a greenhouse goes in there that is growing umpteen thousand cannabis plants, that is going to be somewhat detrimental to the surrounding area. And then the last piece of it is the idea that what Lori was talking about was just increasing it up to the larger acres to allow any intensive growing at all on there. And I apologize, I don't have a pencil with me, but I had another brilliant thought, but I forgot what it was, so we'll have to wait.
Well, okay, you have to get in line behind Counselor Lucero. I just wanted to ask before I get over to Counselor Goldman, would we be able to make that legal argument that we're different because we don't have separate residential zoning? Is that anywhere in the law where they exempted, they said we didn't have to do that?
They did not. So what they gifted us with in the legislature was a local jurisdiction may set reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions and reasonably limit the density of cannabis establishments. The reason I think that Los Ranchos may, and I'm going to say may because they haven't passed this, and I understand why their council is comfortable with this, but the reason that they may get away with this in terms of banning it from the residential/agricultural zone, and I brought this along, and feel free to take a quick gander. I wish I had been a little bit more prepared. But their commercial zone is essentially a strip along 4th Street, much like Corrales Road, but the entirety is commercial.
Right.
They also have some additional, just like you have the northwest sector, they have some additional commercial scattered in with that residential, where they would still be able to do an intensive agricultural grow. So council, having reviewed a map looking as it does, compared to ours, the way that it looks with the very limited commercials we have available, understanding, of course, that there may be the ability to apply for a variance or something like that to become commercial. As the map looks now, if we restrict something to only A1 and A2, it looks very much like we are effectively prohibiting growth regardless of that being our intention. I don't believe that's anybody's intention. I think we very well want to allow with the reasonable protections for the residents. The problem becomes, because most of the village is A1, A2, it does become in practice very prohibitive.
Yeah. Okay. Counselor Waldman?
Randy, is there, Corey, are there any definitions of what a business, what percentage of business we can allow? we have to allow. In other words, we have a couple operations already going. We get credit for that, I assume, even though the law is passed. I mean, how many more do we have to reach the threshold that the state is looking for?
Of being what is reasonable. That's going to be determined by the courts, I have a feeling, or the legislature. As Councilor Knight said, I wouldn't be surprised that if enough folks talk to their legislators about what this is doing to communities, because they didn't give us enough tools to work with dealing with this, I have a feeling the legislature could take another look. But right now, you've heard all the guidance we have.
So, but as of January 1st, they have to come up with more rules, right?
That is for the licensing process. They may leave everything silent in regard to our regulation. They don't have to do any more guidance to us. We could ask for it.
Well, I think, aren't these new classifications, that's something that happened after we passed our ordinance.
The tiers.
The
Yes.
tiers.
Well, I think the other thing too, we're not considering is fees. Because right now, we don't have a fee structure for any grower that comes into the village. And I've noticed Roswell, they have imposed some pretty hefty amounts, similar to what the state is charging for licenses.
And I don't know that that's going to be upheld either.
No.
Because there would be an alfalfa fee and all that.
So remember, shock, there's politics involved in this issue. So there are friends in southeastern counties and municipalities who are taking very strong positions on this legislation, as they did on COVID restrictions and so forth. It's just a political perspective. And so there are jurisdictions in the state who are outright banning this, basically. And so there could be challenges. The question will become, is there someone who wants to grow there? And if there's not anyone who wants to grow there anyway, those laws may not be challenged. So, it's always the situation where you're subject to attack. It doesn't mean you're going to be attacked. In Los Ranchos example, it is as close as we're going to get to us in this region. However, it's not us. How many acres are in the entire county, for example, and the entire village, for example, for us, and how much of it is commercial?
I have those numbers if you want them.
So we have
I do.
204 acres.
204 acres of commercial.
How much is the total
entire
village?
rest of 10.5 square miles is
You're
not.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
I actually have those numbers, but I can get them to you if you want.
It's okay. No, but my point is that will be the test, is were we unreasonably limiting it? And also, don't forget that the state law allows for grows of any size if you get a commercial permit up to a certain amount, and it will not be classified as an intense grow. If some of our citizens would want to just plant 10 rows of marijuana plants once a summer to supplement their income, they could do that. And under the state law. And then if we say you can't do A1 and A2, any size grow, indoor, outdoor, nothing, I think that's going to lead to a problem. That's why I think it's good to look at the size of the grows and the type of grow that we're talking about. For intense agriculture, that's definitely our best bet to limit it the greatest. But there's many steps below intense agriculture that there may, because, we're talking about the citizens, and I don't know how many citizens are going to want to grow marijuana on a commercial level that could get permitted by the state. Who knows? But it certainly is their right to try to do that.
Well, let's change gears a little bit and talk about the nuisance factor of personal growing, because it seems to me that will be one of our other factors that we need to think about. Because obviously the state is wanting to allow personal use regardless of, the rules, or lack of rules. It seems to me that we need to be able to have some form of mechanism by which we can say, you can't have a bright light shining out the window, for a grow room. You can't have odor coming into my adjacent property. You know, it seems like to me that is gonna be another issue that even besides the large growers, that we're gonna have to deal with. Because now they've taken away the police's ability to go search property because of contraband or whatever. So how do we deal with that?
Well, we would look at the use of marijuana growing as we would any other potential legal use that can occur. It can be done legally and without disturbing anyone, or it can be done in a way that harms neighbors. When it does, that's a nuisance. So,
I don't think our nuisance laws are anywhere near ready for that.
Oh, it's time, sorry. All right, Squid Man, Counselor Parker.
A quick question. As far as the state law goes, what are the restrictions that they have in residential areas with, as far as the commercial growing?
There is no such thing.
There's no,
none.
yeah, zero.
I don't, that it's not allowed, or they don't say anything about it?
Completely silent.
Yeah, it seems as if their intent by being silent is that they were looking at, well, maybe they just weren't thinking, but it seems like their intent was as broad as possible a use, leaving all the municipalities to struggle with how to regulate this within their own communities. And I think there is a chance that there will be enough blowback that possibly by the next session, we could have some changes that we could take advantage of. What do you think, Randy? I mean, that's, you know, I don't know.
To me, I think it's communities like the village that have the best chance of working at that, because we can't put ourselves in the legislators' shoes and the drafters of this legislation, but they certainly weren't focused on the welfare of small communities when they drafted this. They just didn't consider it. What I think what they were considering is, we believe this is a community good, and we're going to make it permissive so that it can help the community. That's literally, I think, as simple as it was. And they didn't think about the potential adverse effects. They didn't see it. And
Didn't want to see it.
That, willful blindness is a potential.
Right.
Councilor Wildman?
So, we know that the state looked at a lot of other states, where they drafted the legislation. Do we know, other states must have faced these issues, communities like ours must have faced it. Is there any experience that we could call on?
So, well, I'll start with saying Councilor Murray brought this up to us a couple of days ago, sort of requesting, well, how can we make this work like Colorado has made it work for them? Because they're our neighbors, it seems very apparent to me that whenever they were looking at plant limits, they drew directly from Colorado in terms of the 6 mature plants, the 12 mature plants, the personal use. I don't think it was an accident that they left out so much that they did from pulling from Colorado's language. And the really unfortunate part for us is that Colorado made it an opt-in. If you wanted it to be legal in your county, you had to opt into it. New Mexico, quite on purpose, did not do that for us. The other thing that Colorado did that New Mexico did not was that if you actually search the enacting legislation for local jurisdiction, it's maybe every page, every other page. Frequently they say, here's what can happen, and if it's a locality, you may prohibit. If it's a locality, you may restrict. If it's a locality, you may create setbacks. If it's a locality, you may do these things. I don't think it was unintentional that the legislature left that out for us.
The mayor said, basically leaving up to each.
I think that was entirely on purpose. I do. How they reviewed the legislation that they looked at in creating this one. It left us in a really difficult position because we do have so many unique communities that, they explicitly did not give us, which is one thing that Colorado has, is the ability to regulate personal growth. They very explicitly gave that to Colorado and very explicitly left that out of ours.
I think to Councilor Murray's point, when we're talking about personal growth, they're going to have to be governed the same way that any other, almost like our home occ rules. Like, you're not supposed to have lights that shine. How many of us have gotten these emails? lights that shine directly in your eyes, or, you know, all kinds of different things. And again, it's an enforcement burden, right? A very definite enforcement burden. But that seems to be where that's what we would be left with, and I think the end of one of the articles you said was, it's going to lead to more neighbor disputes. You're like, no kidding.
Yeah.
Counselor Knight?
Well, I had heard on the news probably last week, something about Colorado is changing its potency levels. Have you heard anything about that? Like, at this point, they can have like 70% of what they sell is with THC in it. And they're saying that it's too addictive that high, so they have to drop it down and do potency. So could we do something about potency that would affect?
No, totally not.
I'm afraid that was specifically not gonna happen, because that's one of the few things that is explicitly mentioned in the legislation, which is regardless of potency, and regardless, they said something else, that was really very strange, but it's in the same sentence. But yeah, that's sort of, unfortunately, we're preempted by the Cannabis Control Division, who is sort of our, our governing between the legislature and here. They're who we're looking to for guidance in any sort of instruction.
I have two procedural questions and then two Hail Mary questions. So when you say that the courts will deal with it, what does that process look like? Does a citizen sue us for being disenfranchised and then it goes through the court, or does the state sue us? And part two of that is, what is the length of that process?
There are three ways that it could get to court. The first way would be as if a landowner sued because they want to grow. Secondly, it would be the state choosing to take an action against one or more local governments who they felt were prohibiting unreasonably the growing or sale or whatever of marijuana. The third would be if we did a preemptive declaratory judgment action at some point, if we decide that we want to know for sure if what we're doing is legal, we could ask the court for a judgment to say, we believe we've passed a legal ordinance under the state law. Is it legal? And bring the state in as a party.
Okay.
And in that way, we would prevent or at least limit potential damages, because if someone sues us under the State Act, they could also throw in other claims that were that have money damages involved.
Okay.
So those would be the three ways it would go to court.
And then the two Hail Marys. So privacy with the need for full monitored security with these, is that an angle we can do in residential, that having cameras on property lines adjacent to your property is an invasion of your privacy? And then we keep hearing that state trumps village law. Is there any way we could look at federal trumping state and say, Dark Sky Act that we've opted into is a federal act, and that is superior to a state act that was just passed?
Boy, can of worms time.
I love worms. Hail Mary.
Yeah, I mean, the first one with the cameras is, we've got them all over. That's a no. Not drones.
Right.
Talk about basic invasion of privacy. So
Right.
I think
It's a beautiful word
that
today.
argument is probably not
The-
gonna make it.
the-
The second one, I don't know.
Well, the second one, we had this debate the first year I was with the county, when we came in and there had been portions of our ordinance that had been invalidated. We had to amend it. And there was a discussion about the federalism question, which is, right now, we still have federal laws that are inconsistent with, it's how many recreational and how many medical marijuana states are there? It's over half of the population of the country are in those states now. And there's still no change in federal law. So the question is, well, does that mean that we are in violation of federal law if we're in compliance with state law? And the reality is that there has been an arrangement worked out between the states and the federal government that they're not going to prosecute the states who choose to legalize these uses of marijuana. So I find it highly unlikely that there's going to be action by the federal government. And it's much more likely that there'll be action by the state toward municipalities or counties who they feel are violating their laws.
It's interesting that the states can pass a law under the guise of the federal government looking the other way, but we
It is
cannot
very
pass local and
interesting.
municipality laws under that same guise of
Well,
them
we have- I mean,
doing what's
water's
best for our
preempted.
citizens.
There's lots of areas that are preempted by
States'
state or
rights,
federal laws.
basically.
Agreed, but yeah, but they're operating under this, our next legal authority is saying it's wrong, but we're gonna say it's
Well-
okay, but we're afraid of saying that same thing to the state.
Well, for us, the way our state is structured is we have only the authority the state grants us. We did not exist before the state. The state came first. Now, there were towns that existed prior to the state, and the court's cases have held
Strauss
that
might be
they,
one of them. I mean, it wasn't incorporated. but-
Silver City was one for sure. Silver City was one that was here. It was a township under the territorial government. And the court had held in regard to them that they have to follow state law. So, I mean, we're limited by state law, unfortunately in some cases, fortunately in others.
Randy, a couple of questions. Lori's suggestion about the 4 acres, is that something that we could bundle that, perhaps with a couple other issues, and ask the state, go to court and ask the state to join us in that? Would that be an example of your third possibility?
Well, so here, speaking as the attorney for the village, my job is to protect you and to guide you to do the best thing for the village, the best I can. Whenever we have something that is brand new like this, and as we've stated, we received almost less than zero guidance from the state. I think we should be conservative. That's why I've proposed what I have. That said, if it is the will of the governing body to go a little farther and attempt to do a little more to limit those areas where marijuana can be grown, then I would say, let's do it in a way that is reasonable and it's rationally related to the goals we have, like protecting residences. Look, the llanos that run, the historic lots that run through the village, they are a terrible place to do any use that is intense and can cause anything to percolate outside of that strip of property, because they're all so close together. All the houses are sometimes on 50-foot strips of land. So that's an example of, that seems more reasonable to regulate that more strictly. And so lot size, that's why we ended up with this model we have. The size of the land gives us greater buffers. That's logical. That's reasonable.
Would you be able to take what you did now and see if we could include, like Lori's suggestion of increasing it some more and see what would happen with that?
Yes, we can. Here's the rub that I want us to consider though now, before we bring anything else back again. What do you do about the little guy that can get a permit to grow 100 plants, open air grow? He chooses to do that, and he gets a state permit, and then we say no because you're on an acre or 2 acres. Do you think that we could allow up to a certain number of plants for that type of a grow, so we are not placing a restriction on our citizens who that's their desire to utilize their land in that way, or not? But if we did, then it's going to be looked at as more reasonable if we can do it in a way that we're protecting residences.
Let me just follow up. So instead of going to court,
I'm gonna have to
could we
separate
get
you boys.
an opinion from the Attorney General, perhaps?
Oh, it's not worth any more than my opinion. You know, it's looked to as,
Which carries the day.
it's looked to as precedent, but then it can be overturned immediately by a court.
I think one, the open air grow is gonna be a moot question because you're only gonna be limited to certain periods of the year in which you could do a growth. And if this industry is gonna be like it is, they're gonna want production all the time, 24/7, which means they'll have plants in certain states. They'll have the mature plants coming up. It's gonna be a continuous process. As soon as you go to winter, your open air is done. So I think we're gonna wind up with greenhouses being the intensive grow for anything that comes into the village.
Well, remember, the intensive grow is specifically defined by state law as over 200?
The larger uses is 201 up through 8,000, I think is the maximum right now.
But it's still gonna be a greenhouse thing, because I don't think you'll see an open grow, because it's just not gonna be profitable.
Yeah, you're not gonna grow 8,000 plants to die in this fall.
No, but we wouldn't be able, I mean, I think the
Right,
truth is,
right.
we probably can't control that, and to the extent that we would allow what we can't control anyway in order to have a more restrictive law in other ways, more, that's
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
one thing you do to be more reasonable and not disenfranchise, especially smaller landholders.
But that's why I was also advocating that, greenhouses of a certain size, if they were 500 square feet, they had to have a certain setback. Anything over that, then the setback gets bigger. And I think that's where you're gonna be, is you're gonna have greenhouses, and that's where the money's gonna be. Now, I don't know, what your scheme is that based on open grow, or is that based on a greenhouse?
It's based on either one. The state does not allow us to restrict either. We have to reasonably allow, except for time, place, and manner, both. Now what the state regulations have done, and why don't you walk through that real quick, as to how the state regulating grows has ratcheted it up to different sizes, and how we may be able to use that.
Sure. So the way that the state has regulated this is that the producers are on essentially a tiered system, and it's done very similar in manufacturing. I think that may in fact be where they have started to conflate things, whole separate tangents. But so for grows, your personal use goes up to 12 mature plants, which, by the way, a whole different tangent. The 12 mature plants, for all intents and purposes, is going to be the smelly ones and the ones we care about. So 13 up to 100 is the next level. So anything between 13 and 200 is considered a micro grow or a micro business. Those, it appears from the intention of the state, those are the things that are going to be the most permissive, and the things that I think that they have built in to be the most flexible in terms of the permitting requirements and the licensing requirements and all of the sort of arduous process that they put on everything. Because if you look, their schedule of fees is dramatically lower for a micro business than anything else. And I don't think that was by accident. So once you hit 201, then you become a commercial grower or a commercial producer. And then they go from there up to 1,000, from 1,000 up to 3,000, from 3,001 up to 8,000, and that's the current maximum. And so they, for all intents and purposes, have developed this plant limit scheme with the little guy in mind at 200 or less, which for us and for the unique landscape, we may disagree with that. I think that it's a worthwhile formulation to think, okay, state says 200 is where we draw the line at, that's favoring the little guy. Anything over that, maybe we should be considering pushing that into a more commercial or a larger parcel. But how do we reconcile that with what the state has put in place for us? I don't totally know, but that's sort of the landscape that we have.
Yeah, I think you're right. There was an intent to try to help the little guy. Councilor Parker, you have a question?
Yeah, maybe it's more of a statement that whether it's 200 plants or 1,000 plants, I personally don't know what the impact that's going to be on the surrounding neighborhood of wherever that facility goes in. And so I think that maybe there needs to be more of an understanding of what those limitations are. But because you said that the state is silent on the residential aspect of this, those guidelines that they're giving by default appear to be for a commercial location to grow these things. And so in my head that they don't, we have to provide them with a location to grow. They do not say the amount of area that we provide, just that we have locations for them to grow on there. And so at the very minimum, if it is to be allowed in A1 or A2, I think there has to be some type of special use permit that has very strict enforcements, that as soon as they're in violation of it, that place can no longer exist on there, just to really protect everyone in the community from what's coming in. Because honestly, I appreciate everyone's work on this, but I still think we're somewhat clueless on the impact of what this is gonna do.
I have a little bit of an idea.
Randy?
Can I just ask one question since we're on this, tier deal? I'm sorry, did he have a question to answer?
No, I think he just wanted
Oh, okay.
to.
Just real quick on this tier deal. I read through somewhere in our packet, they had 1 to 2 acres, 100 plants, 2 to 5 acres, 300 plants. And then it goes on. What's the, wouldn't it be 1 to 2 acres and then 3 to 5 acres? Can you explain that a little bit? I have it right here. For parcels between 1 or 2 acres, regardless of zone, 100 mature cannabis plants. And then it has here, and then it says for parcels 2 to 5 acres, regardless of zone, 200 mature plants. So 1 to 2, 2 to 5.
Like 2.01 would fall in the upper category. And
So anything over 2 acres would go, okay.
But you gotta be careful about regardless of zone, because we already banned it in the H.
Right.
So we're gonna have to specify that.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Kind of an off-the-wall question, but, in reading the legislation, on page 20, it says, as of September 1st, there'd be a Public Health and Safety Advisory Committee. So my question is, do they have any enforcement capabilities? And if so, is that something that we could use to perhaps look at the elephant at the north end of the village?
Has there been one appointed, do you
I was
know?
gonna say, am I mistaken, or is that not for 2022?
No, it's
2021.
9/1/21.
Now, the other side of the coin of that is the air quality issue as well. We could form an air quality board within the village to deal with odor and so forth.
There's federal guidelines to that too. There's federal guidelines for air quality.
Allows us to do that.
Well, I don't know if odor falls under air quality.
It does.
It has to do with the health and welfare of the public. Anything can probably be, I think there may be health issues with terpene, who knows? You can get a densely packed, air filter being, emitting, you might have, health issues,
Where did I see that? They did address it here, and they made it specific.
Do they have a specific, testing mechanism?
Certification, the applicant will adhere to applicable federal, state, and local laws governing the protection of public health and the environment, including occupational health and safety, food safety, fire safety, environmental impacts, natural resource protections, air quality, solid and hazardous waste management, and wastewater discharge. I think that kind of just repeated what we've kind of, I think that's kind of repeated, but there's something in there for it, and
We're happy to look at it.
yeah, okay, yeah.
In looking at the direction that we would like, council to consider then going forward,
Just say it.
Yeah, right.
Just say it.
We just need to give some direction if we're planning on trying to come up with potential amendments, and what those might look like. And maybe we need to have them do a risk management assessment of what happens if we go ahead and ban it in A1 and A2. What do we think our risk is for that? And what would happen if we kind of bump up the scheme that you've kind of come up with, and we just further limit the density of the plants depending on acreage.
I think also the limitation of the consumption areas, we can also control that density as well. I think there are plenty of examples around the state where people, villages and towns have done that. I mean, they've exceeded the 300 feet. I think Roswell's gone to a quarter mile.
Yeah, they get.
Doesn't mean they're legal.
Yeah, they're not gonna.
But it means they haven't been challenged yet.
Right, they're legal right now, today they're legal.
Absolutely, we can
And
pass
no
anything
lawyer-
we want.
Right.
No lawyer seems to be in kind of that. Different
Well, you
part of town, different part of the country, I understand.
Well, and I also think, we know what kind of foot setbacks we had when we were doing every other kind of commercial thing, 300 feet, 1,000 feet, we've been there. There's plenty of law on that we've already done.
Can I ask you something would be an appropriate question? Would it be appropriate to ask the counselors what, if they were writing this bill, what their kind of 3 bullet points would be for each of the counselors to answer? Or is that that way we kind of get a sense of where everybody's head's at?
I think it's fair. I think that Corey and I have made ourselves clear of our legal challenges.
Right.
We've talked that to death. We all know that the state didn't give us the tools we'd like to have to handle this. So that aside, if we did intense grows, so that's the biggest grows, with the highest acreage, and raise the acreage limit for that and kind of cascade down in the commercial areas. So in other words, in a commercial area, you're still going to have X number of acres for a grow. And then for the reasons stated, here's my biggest issue is for those doing micro grows, where do we draw that line? Right now, we went all the way down to that 1 acre to 2 acres for 100 plants. That's still pretty intense. What if, so I guess the question would be is if we bring back to you a proposal where we do a number of acres for micro grows that we think is reasonable, given the protection of residential uses that we have to include in this, and then work up from there to the largest acres plus commercial areas for intense grows.
Randy, I had a question about that.
Come on over so
You
people
gotta
can
be
hear you.
closer to,
Sorry, in the village of Corrales, do we have to allow those huge grows at all?
We had an
Can we
acre,
ban those?
we had an acre threshold they couldn't meet, we wouldn't.
Well, it wouldn't be reasonable then. So the point is, we need to be reasonable. If we have the place where we think this can be done without harming residential areas, then we should allow it. And remember, that's anything over 200 plants. It's 200 to 1,000. It's not very big.
I was thinking of the 8,000 plant category.
Sure.
Do we have to allow those upper tiers at all?
I mean,
Can we?
we don't know. We don't know.
Well-
I can give you my easy answer, and that is that's gonna depend on the state, because here's where the rub is really for us. We shall not prohibit the operation of a licensee. Theoretically, the state got around that by saying, okay, go to your zoning board and get the zoning permit, and then come to us to apply for a license. So arguably, they should not have a license unless they have approval first. The
That's
problem is, they built in a caveat to that, where in fact they have an exception process. So now, if a licensee applies to the state, gets a license, and then comes to us and says, give me zoning approval, we may have to find ourselves finding a place for them to go.
No,
If we choose to not regulate that at all, we may be in trouble.
I don't think so, because that is a temporary license, which allows them to now come back to the municipality for approval. If we turn it down, then they may be lost altogether. The state may say, okay, fine. City turn them down, you don't have a license. That's a possibility.
Possibly.
I think the other thing is too, but with Lori's comment, you gotta have water rights. And if you don't have the water rights, you don't get to grow. And that's gonna be the other sticking point, and the state engineer has kind of said, hey, it's gonna be a year or two before anybody even gets those
Well, and let's not forget, the last time, I think it was Zach that asked, how many people have thought one of these things, and the answer is one.
You're right.
So, you know, we have some things in our favor in terms of limiting the, you know, our attractiveness.
We may have an update.
Counselor Knight?
I had about 10 to 12 people come to me with greenhouse plans, and I talked to them all about this water right, and then they have vanished from this.
Okay.
They're trying to search for that. I've had 2 people tell me they have one.
Well, and that's, you know, that is possibly true, but it looks like maybe if the majority of people don't have the water rights,
I
then
think
they
some
don't
of
have
them
a
are
use.
thinking, you know, we're gonna make a bunch of money here, so let's do this, and they don't really have the wherewithal to do what they think they
Right.
want.
I'm gonna
Like, there's
have
a
Counselor
situation-
Knight to
Sorry.
speak, she's been patient.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. Can we limit the number of licenses that Corrales gives out?
Reasonably. And that, I mean, that's gonna be the catch, and I don't know how we do that. Because we do have the ability, and that was one of the, I mean, thankfully, saving graces we do have, is to limit the density of the licenses. So,
Okay, so that's a
What other
positive thing,
kind
and-
of businesses, do we have any yardsticks, like where we say, you know?
liquor's our biggest yardstick.
Yeah, I
and they-
know, and they've
I mean,
kind of undone that.
the unfortunate part about that, and I did a little bit of research on this, was to see what that density looks like. Thankfully, in Corrales, it's about 7, just for a frame of reference. You've got about 7 breweries, distilleries, things that would sort of fall into that category. Which, I mean, that's sort of more on the manufacturer retail side of things, but I mean, that's a good benchmarker, is 7. So you could reasonably think, okay, well, maybe that's 7 producers, over that 200 plant limit, or over the, you know, if we choose to draw our line at, you know, Corrales microbusiness means 50 plants, whatever that may look like. You know, where we choose to draw that line, you know, that many producers, you know, we can have up to 7 in this, whichever district we agree on, or whatever kind of zoning we want to look at. That might be our good density number. We may have to seriously evaluate that, what that really looks like, knowing that we do have some intensive agriculture uses that aren't cannabis grows. And, you know, does that play into, that limit on density? I don't know.
So we can look at density. We naturally get to density limits if we increase the acres required for growers.
Yeah, but you don't want them adjacent to each other. We need to spread them out a little bit so they're
Why?
not right next door to each other.
Why?
Because it's a cumulative effect, basically. If you have adjacent growers, you get in the odor of that collective area.
But if we're putting them in commercial and, you know,
Well, you limit-
large
you
acreages.
You put the limits on how many you want to have. But the water rights too, I think what Kevin's talked about, if you have these guys all adjacent, and they're pulling 8 or 10 acres of water out of that collective area, you're gonna impact the wells around that.
Well, yeah, but if they give water rights,
Yeah,
or
that's
they
not
have
our,
water
we can't do
rights,
anything about
yeah,
that.
That's why
we're not
you
in
limit-
control.
But we gotta protect
I
it,
had
it
my
doesn't matter,
other- the
I'm
second
sorry,
half-
now, go ahead.
I've been patient. Okay, so the second, thing I wanted to bring up again is about enforcement. I think we need to help those people at the northern end now. And so I think we need to set something up where, once Lori starts getting complaints, how many complaints do you need to get after you check out the smells and things like that, that they start to go get citations? And how much is a citation per day, things like that? Because that's another thing we haven't addressed, the sequence of events that happens, you know, once there is a complaint.
Well, we have a sequence for complaints. It's not a different process than what we already have.
But do we need a different process?
I think our biggest problem is, when do we cite them for odor violations?
Well, and I think what we get to is looking at the requirement that we can impose upon them for, make sure their filtration system is being maintained adequately, focusing on that versus the odor, because like I said, now that can be the canary in the coal mine, you know, with the complaint can come in based upon odor, and we look at ensuring that they're changing the filters often enough. I think that's the enforcement that,
I agree with
I
that.
think even if they're changing them every day and it still is negatively affecting all of the residents, they're still in violation of the law. Even if they're changing them every hour, they're
Well,
still in
if-
violation of nuisance laws.
Well, let me ask you something. You live in an agricultural area. Do you like the smell of manure? Do you find that to be obnoxious?
You get used to it.
Yeah, exactly. You get used to it. I mean, whatever we impose, we have to be able to enforce it so that we get to that
But
result.
we have ordinances that control that. We say you keep your pens clean, you pick up after your animals.
Well, and the bottom line too, that we're going to have to adapt to this change in the culture of the state. They say specifically, this is just another agricultural plant. If you're growing it and it's in its natural condition, the odor from that plant isn't a nuisance, by definition.
I think they got their head up their collective butt too.
Well,
Number one, do we know, how many plants are actually being grown in North End?
Somebody
should.
somebody gave me a number today. Do you know, Aaron? No. I don't know why
Well, did you?
I thought it was around 800, but I'm not sure if that's correct or not.
Did you see the, news item tonight about the Evergreen building going out with grants? $300 million, and they showed this stack of greenhouses that are going up.
Sure.
Oh,
Out
And
there.
it shadows the Tularosa one. I have one quick question. Just, and this doesn't need a long answer, I just need like a yes or no. When someone gets a permit for water rights, or they have water rights, or they acquire water rights, and where does the state engineer play? Because they gotta take a permit to the state engineer, saying, I'm gonna be using this water for this commercial use. Does the state engineer allow a well to be on commercial use?
No, so I'm gonna go for a long answer on this one because I actually have.
Yes or no?
Long answer.
Hey, we get paid by the hour, don't
They
forget.
do not allow any well to operate for water, and the reason that I'm gonna go into the long answer with this is because, and I had a conversation with someone from the state engineer's office. It was a very lengthy conversation, and some frustrations were vented, because we're not the only ones who got blindsided. Lo and behold, of course, no one's happy to be in the hot seat for doing the permitting. But the way that it was built with, some very limited input from the state engineers, so they're doing the best they can, is that you may only do an indoor grow with a commercial water right. For well users, that means that your well has to be rated a commercial well. Most wells around the state are not gonna be a commercial well.
Not here,
No, and it's gonna be the case pretty much nowhere.
nowhere.
Because getting a well is a permitted right for any New Mexican.
Nappy is the only place, I think, in the state that has a
Anyone
commercial
who
well.
wants to do an indoor
Well,
grow is
that-
going to have a commercially rated
Doesn't
well
have a
or
well.
water right for commercial use, which is gonna come from a municipal supply, not your commercial well. The alternative to that is that an outdoor grow may provide evidence of an irrigation right, not a well right.
Mhm.
You can have both and do both, but you cannot have one and do the other. So,
Right, you can't argue that you have irrigation rights in a greenhouse growing
correct.
8,000
And they
plants.
very
You can't.
specifically say that that's
So-
not the case.
The state engineer has a responsibility to check these things, right? No.
Oh, again, I'm not trying to be negative. I just know that from our experience in relying on the state
there's the,
water
Yeah, no,
engineer,
you understood.
we don't feel they've done their job. You can
Understood.
read a lot of things from planning and zoning minutes, very frustrated with what they feel is a lack of enforcement. They're probably really gonna get a lot of additional pressure, because of this law. But we're stuck, that's one of the hard parts of our situation, is we rely on, and we must rely on the state for some of these things, and we don't feel they actually have been following through, right? So,
I also had a conversation with the state engineer, and he basically told me that Comadina's facility up there, they can use that domestic well as a commercial use as long as it's metered coming off the domestic side of it. So you can have a house, you can have your greenhouse, and if you got a commercial greenhouse, the greenhouse has to be metered and it has to have a commercial permit.
But you're still allowed so much water.
It's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
He says you cannot use past that. If you get
Right.
10 acres,
Right. Nope, fine.
that's it.
Yeah.
nobody can.
But that's why they meter those commercial operations, is so that they don't exceed that capability.
That is one way to get around, I guess, the commercial well.
that won't get around it. And that's one thing that we keep,
I'm sorry, did you say what now?
we won't be able to get around needing
Okay.
a commercial water.
Okay.
And the thing that we keep going back to is the Comedina farm. And the problem with that is that the history of them is that they slipped in before there was a regulation for medical growing in the village. So what they have essentially is a completely unregulated by the village grow. What we're attempting to do is put something in place so that that doesn't happen again. Because if it's not everybody's complaint that that smell is horrible, we have been able to do nothing about it.
Sure.
It sure would be nice that anything that goes up in the future, at the very least, has what we know now is the best technology.
And the good news is we can regulate the Comedina's use. We simply can't take it away.
Right.
So we can put new regulations in place that apply to them as well as any other grower.
Yeah, we can't target them, but we can certainly,
Did they have to come back to the village to get a license?
No, because they're a medical grower.
But that's going away. Medical cannabis is gonna be folded into cannabis altogether.
Well,
And there will be no distinction.
what happens. We don't know
Yeah,
how
there's
that's gonna be
a permit
done.
renewal time for them. If under the medical cannabis scheme they had in place, and I'm not entirely sure what it used to look like, I do not know. But if under the medical cannabis scheme that they had to apply for a license renewal, they may very well be before us asking for a permit. I don't know what that answer is.
do you have something you want to say, Lori? I'm sorry, Councilor Wolman, I was just, okay, you were just excited, Councilor Wolman.
This is more of a political question than a legal question. Between now and January, would it be worthwhile having our state representative, state senator, come and sit down with us and say, look, these are our concerns. You're gonna probably be hearing from an awful lot of communities across the state. This is what Corrales needs from you, to perhaps look at the law.
I think as you establish your legislative agenda, and you may do that for this issue, it would be good to get started early if there's a consensus of the council that there's no reason we
haven't
can't.
always done that, but, you know, our community, unlike other communities, hasn't always put together a legislative agenda
Yeah.
of items we want to push.
I think we
This
need
could
to,
well be one we would want to push.
Yeah.
And,
I'm sure there'll be other communities that have similar.
I've had
Interesting things.
conversations with our legislators, and I think maybe they are not yet exactly understanding the amount of, you know, pushback, right?
Yeah.
And the amount of problems that
And-
we're having.
And I think that you can't help but look at the larger municipal model and say, well, what's the problem? You know, there's these big industrial lots, and they've got a big industrial warehouse.
Right.
It's all good.
Or even the larger rural model, the
Even
other
a place
side of
like,
the extreme.
even a place like Bernalillo,
Yeah.
right? They've got that huge operation on Don Tomas, but it's a small community, but they have the industrial area.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
We don't have
they,
that.
you know, their political will is different than ours, and, you know, we're not Bernalillo. And so,
And the community is set up differently than ours, so.
so, well, all right, so, good talk. What I really think we can, ask of our council is to, do you feel fairly clear about what you want to try
I
to
think
do on
so.
our behalf?
Does anyone sitting at the table or, out in the octopus,
Yeah.
do any of you see the direction we're kind of headed as being the wrong direction? And that you don't want us to try to look at increasing the acreage and also at the same time going commercial and looking at tightening up the regs on particularly the odor?
Yeah, enforcement regulations and schemes.
I was gonna say, I would like you to do a risk analysis on the total ban of A1 and A2, what that might cost us in the long run, if we got challenged. And then we'll tier back and look at what we can do and to mitigate anything else that happens. I also think we need to put a restriction on personal growth where, you know, it's either observation, light pollution, vehicle and foot traffic, noise from exhaust fan, nuisance factors. I think we need to look at that for personal use, because to me, that is gonna be another issue. Because if my neighbor decides he wants to put a greenhouse up and he's got his 10 plant or 12 plants plus the intermediate stuff that's already in the process of growing, it's, you know, I don't want to smell that.
I worry if we attack personal use, we're gonna have a
Just-
lot more people upset
Well,
with us than if we.
And I have to say, we are allowed to grow what
Right.
we want
No,
on our
no, no,
property.
no, you're not, because there are other examples around the state where they have banned.
Doesn't mean they're right.
Doesn't
No, but I
mean they're
mean,
right,
in
doesn't mean
our-
they're wrong
In
either.
our community, I can put up a little greenhouse and I can grow vegetables or
But you
whatever,
don't
and I,
need to have a searchlight in there growing that stuff coming over
well,
on
then
my
that's a
property.
nuisance. That's just
But
like
our
those.
nuisance laws are just weak.
Right,
Well,
But
I
that's a
mean,
correction of the nuisance laws, not a
Right.
correction of,
Well, but it's still, I think we can put limitations on personal use.
Madam
But-
Mayor,
Anyway,
Yes,
can I say something? I have some expertise, and I know this is a work study, but I have a person who knows a lot, who's a master cannabis grower, and he's given me some information. I talk to him every week, and he's given me information that might help you all in formulating something. Can I have a couple minutes?
that's Fred,
Fred.
yeah.
Fred?
you know, are you going to be saying this? Because, this is our work study as elected representatives.
I understand, but I have some expertise, I think, that nobody else in that room has, and I might be able to contribute
Oh, this
something.
is Fred. Hi, Fred. I'm so
Hi.
sorry, Fred. I think that what I'd like for you to do is if you feel that you have this expertise, please submit it in written form, and the lawyers and the council will consider that as we look at the next iteration for the amendment. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
I think that's the best way to make sure we really take appropriate notice of what you have to add. Okay?
That's fine.
Thank you.
just,
Go ahead.
sorry, real quick on the risk analysis issue, that's a very difficult issue to discuss in a public meeting. It may be that we
work session.
might, no,
No, an
we might
executive
need an
session.
executive
Okay.
session
Okay.
for potential litigation
Okay.
risk.
But that's good, yeah.
So my thought on this plan of having different sizes on different size lots, I like that idea, but I still, 200 plants does not feel like a micro grow to me. I don't think people with a 1 acre lot are gonna be happy that their neighbor with a 1 acre lot even has 50 plants. I feel like that is still, at that point, they're not gonna care. They're gonna get all the downside with a mad neighbor because they didn't get to grow 200 plants instead of 50 plants. So nobody wins in that. I think we really just need to tear the Band-Aid off and figure out a solution that protects people. And my leaning is to get rid of A1 and A2. And I know there's challenges to that, and I get that, and I am very sympathetic to small farmers that this would create a hardship for, but I'm more sympathetic to their 22 neighbors that it creates a hardship for. So that's where I stand.
I gotta agree with Zach. I'm sorry, Mel. I gotta agree with Zach. We have to, I think we have to look hard at limiting it. We don't wanna restrict nobody from growing, but on the same token, we need to protect the quality of life of the people here in Crouse. That's the most important, that's the most important thing, I think, to everybody at this table. I'm sorry, Mel, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and don't forget the limiting the number of licenses.
Yeah, I think that's another good, perhaps neutral, right? A neutral way of doing it that won't necessarily make us look like we're being discriminatory. We've done it in other regulated industries, we do the same thing. So that's part of our community.
I clearly hear what you're saying, and what I'll do is attempt to create something that works. Corey and I will put together some options, and then I don't think we can have anything ready for introduction, given that we're not even sure where we're going, but let's lay all those out, and then we'll pick what we want to do for introduction at the next time we consider this.
Okay, I think that's what we have to do, and knowing that it is all still a moving target. But Corey, you don't feel that they're gonna unleash more different things on us?
My best guess is that they've shifted their attention from manufacture to retail and education and testing facilities.
Okay,
So I think that we're going to be facing a few waves of different regulations before they even come back to producers another time. I guess my only ask to the governing body is a sense of if we pretend that we're going to go down the proposed road of limiting based on acreage, which effectively limits the license density, that understanding that, 50 feet or 50 plants doesn't feel like a micro grow to your neighbor, especially on those llanos where, you're gonna have maybe 50 feet to work with. What would be that smallest number? And I understand this is sort of arbitrary line drawing in the sand, but thinking if this is you next door to someone growing their 12 mature plants and you have to stomach that, and there's nothing you can do
I'd
about
say
that.
12.
Yeah, that's good, yeah, 12, good.
Everyone can go 12, if they
12
want
good.
to sell, they can, if they don't
No,
want
they
to sell.
can't sell.
Well, they can if they meet the qualifications of commercial, right? If we limit it to 12 plants.
Well, I mean, if they apply for a commercial license, but they
Correct.
probably won't go through the expense when they, for their own use. But,
Cash only.
well,
Well,
but
yeah,
then more
you
may
know-
not be being reasonable. That's where, that's the push and the
To
pull
them
of
or
it.
to the other 22 people in the neighborhood?
Did you have
To
something
every-
you wanted
To
to
the
add?
state and to the
They're,
judge.
out of my list of 3 people, they're third, the state is in the list.
I just had a question. So there are some folks who have had conversations with my department about the greenhouse. So if someone shows up and they've got a water right, a legitimate water right, if that's something they've been able to obtain or they already have, and they come with greenhouse building plans, how long do we think we can reasonably stall them?
You don't stall.
You don't stall, just go with what
We
we've got
don't have a
now?
moratorium in place. We have our current regulations.
That would be the
and
regulation.
we apply
Okay,
them.
That was the question.
Yep.
Okay, I have a question, Lori. So what's gonna happen tomorrow? Are you gonna send out Sherry Rice? Or are, I wanted to help these people that are down there that are
Yeah, exactly.
complaining,
Yep.
So
Let's talk.
what do we do?
Well, someone made the point, so we get people who say, my neighbor has horses and piles of manure and it stinks and there's flies. All we can do at this point in time is go to them and say, you have to clean up, you have to get one of those manure-only carts, and we need you to clean up, most of the manure every week, every 7 days. That's what our ordinance says. And to Randy's point about odor, one person's bad smell is another person's, oh, that's great, I'm gonna breathe deeply.
Right.
So how do we measure that, and what is it we take to our municipal judge?
That's the problem.
What's the actual, we have to have a citable violation.
Okay,
We'll,
so really, we're not gonna do anything.
Would
at
you
this
like
point.
to?
I don't know what we can do.
Mayor, Councilor Knight, I think that what we'll do is we'll look at under our current regulations, now that we have put in place requirements that growers have certain types of filtration systems, and look to see how far we can go with that.
There has to be a tangible
That,
thing.
we have to have that, yes, we have to
Not
have
So
that
there's
tangible.
nothing like decibels when it comes to noise, right?
Yeah, you
Nothing for odor similar to that.
can't grab
So
it in a can and bring it to the judge.
So it's,
All right, well, I'm gonna,
Well,
but I think
right?
actually the village is going to make every effort to see what is possible. So, do I have a motion to adjourn at this point?
Go.
All right, I'm gonna
Good
take that.
talk, good talk,
Good talk.
good talk, y'all.